Good evening. I request all the participants to come a little bit in the front. That will be better. All of you, please, can you please come down to the front of the auditorium? Actually, the speaker is not going to use any slides. So it is much better to actually be very cozy around her and then listen to her. Thank you. We'll start the talk in just in a few minutes. Okay, so good evening and welcome to today's TIFR Gender Harmony Cell and Asset Joint Colloquium. I request Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, today's speaker, to come on the stage, accompanied by Dr. Professor Sandhya Kaushika and Professor Arnab Bhattacharya. Okay, let me first welcome to Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, and I request Arnab, Professor Arnab Bhattacharya, the Center Director of Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education, to formally welcome today's speaker with TIFR's memento. Okay, so I mentioned that this is a joint colloquium being organized by the TIFR Gender Harmony Cell and Asset Colloquium. I will formally introduce ASSET. ASSET stands for Advances in Science, Engineering and Technology. This is a colloquium series that happens at 4 o'clock every Friday. The topics of such a colloquium are usually centered around engineering, technologies, detectors, and other instrumentation related topics which are pertinent to experimental sciences. But we also organize colloquia which are generally around medical sciences and technologies, which is of course very important for general public, but also has a huge overlap with the research that goes on in the campus here. So obviously today's talk perfectly fits in that slot, but more importantly, we have Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, who of course has been, I would say, a household name, if I can use that word, in the times of troubled times that we had gone through a few years ago. That is Dr. Soumya. So now may I request Sandhya Kaushika the chair of Gender Harmony Cell of TIFR, to introduce the Gender Harmony Cell itself, and also at the same time also introduce today's speaker and conduct rest of the proceedings.
Welcome everybody who's here, but also watching on Zoom and on YouTube. It's a real pleasure to have Soumya here today. The Gender Harmony Cell has been trying to get her to visit TIFR and give a talk for some time, and very happy she could make it today. For the people like me who during the pandemic had the opportunity to hear Dr. Swaminathan in multiple WHO and other fora, it was remarkable to see how she was committed to bringing science and evidence into health policy, into helping governments have all the information they needed to make good decisions. And for every WHO science forum that I attended, which were long talks spread over several hours, I saw her sit in each one of them, assimilate it, summarize it in the end in an extremely balanced fashion, emphasizing several points. Having standards, being ethical, being inclusive, looking at data from all parts of the world, and serving the needs of people from all parts of the world. And this commitment of hers has been visible from early on. She got trained as a doctor in Armed Forces Medical College. Then she went on to do research both in UK and in the US before she came back and joined the National Institute. And there she became a director. Commitment, sorry, whoever's phone or whatever it is should be bringing commitment to neglected tropical diseases, of which TB is one of them. You can actually go and look at Google Scholar or PubMed to see the large number of contributions she made. Then she went on to become the Director General of ICMR. And then, of course, everybody knows her position as in the WHO as a Chief Scientific Advisor, and now she's the chairperson of MSRRF. And as a member of the Gender Harmony Committee, what we felt was, given her commitment not only to public health, but also to inclusivity, and also to making sure that there is ethics in the kind of support and information that is there in the public space for health and other issues, she would be an excellent speaker in this forum, and we welcome her today. And the floor is all for Soumya now. We are very eager to hear what you have to say. And I should not forget to mention, she's had the ringside view of the worldwide development of science to the entire pandemic, as well as looking at what the response of every government has been.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arnab and Sandhya. It's indeed a great pleasure to be in this beautiful auditorium, in this beautiful campus. It is my first visit to TIFR, but I hope to get to know many more of you and continue to engage and if possible, collaborate. In fact, on a side note, we had Arnab in one of our committees, which would be quite surprising if you think about the fact that he's not a biologist, he's not a medical person, but I actually set up a group of experts to look at transmission of airborne pathogens, because we learned so much during the pandemic about how the SARS-CoV-2 virus actually transmits. And most of that information and data came from, not from medical people, but from physicists and people who had studied, the way that, particles move through the air. So there was a wonderful collaboration that took place actually, and many of very good insights came from that. And I hope that those insights will now also help us pave the way for researching more on, diseases like tuberculosis, for example, or influenza, or any one of the other respiratory pathogens and how it spreads. Because if you remember, there was and still is a lot of debate about what are the best methods of prevention. It's very difficult to do a randomized trial of an intervention, especially if it's a public health intervention like masking. When you're in the middle of a pandemic, you cannot do a randomized trial. It's almost impossible. And so we can talk a little bit about that, how public health decisions need to be made sometimes, even when there is no data, and how you would go about doing that. But certainly over the course of the last 3 years, we learned a lot more about transmission. So that's one connection with Arnab, which happened in the last year. So let me take a step back a little bit and tell you that when I went to the WHO, I had a role as the deputy DG, but over the next 15 months or so, we went through a transformation. And one of the things that came out of this was the fact that the WHO, which is the normative health agency of the United Nations, a multilateral organization, which is essentially composed of member states. So we have 194 member states. When you think about WHO, many people don't realize that it's actually the 194 member states that are WHO. They meet at the World Health Assembly, they make policy, they make the rules, and the Secretariat basically services the member states and does what they are asked to do. So WHO doesn't tell or can't order countries what to do. Countries tell WHO, do this for us because this is a priority. So it is definitely a science and a data-driven organization, but the fact is that there was no explicit way in which that was demonstrated. So everybody felt that you needed a science division, and so this role of a chief scientist was created in March of 2019, and a science division was created. There was also a data division that was created because that was the other key role of WHO really is around health data and being able to collect and analyze and disseminate the global data on health and set the standards for data as well. Then, of course, there are a large number of technical areas all the way from A to Z, and you can organize them in different ways, and that keeps happening every few years. But I think these were some of the notable changes which happened. The other thing, of course, is that WHO also has multiple levels at which it works. So you have the headquarters in Geneva, then you have regional offices, 6 of them. And India is in the Southeast Asia regional office. The headquarters is in Delhi. And then you have country offices, about 150 odd country offices. So again, there's also that 3 levels which need to work together in order to deliver on the programs. So I was charged with creating the science division, setting it up. And essentially, I looked at it from 2 views. One is an inward-facing role of the chief scientist and the science division to essentially perform a quality assurance function for the organization, because we are a standard-setting organization. So it was about how do you get the best data, the best evidence, and do it in the best possible method that all the guidelines which come out of WHO should be quality assured. And while there are processes, there isn't that sort of uniformity across, and also modernizing the way in which we do guidelines. For example, very often there are guidelines which are not updated for many years. Now, in the case of COVID, we realized that things are changing on a weekly basis, right? And so we needed to update our guidance as new data came out. So what we did was setting up something called the living systematic reviews, which continuously was scanning the literature and updating so every time a new clinical trial came out, say on a drug, it would update the meta-analysis and systematic review. And then the guideline development group would meet to see whether that made a change in the recommendation of a drug being effective or not effective or moderately effective, and at what level of confidence you could say that. That kind of innovation we wanted to bring into the mainstream of WHO, where all guidelines actually undergo that type of rigorous um, check and a sort of a scanning of the literature, perhaps even using artificial intelligence at some point can be done in order to inform the Secretariat that certain guideline might need to be updated without waiting, for years together. So I think like that, there were many innovations which happened and, just through necessity. But in any way, so the norms and standards function of WHO, that was one focus. Similarly, in research, also, research was actually enshrined as one of the roles of WHO right from the beginning. There were 6 guiding principles. Not that WHO needs to be, it's not a research agency, but it definitely needs to promote and facilitate and coordinate research where needed, particularly when it relates to a public health priority. So we were talking earlier about how the world, the whole process of R&D today is very much, driven by funding, and the funding from the big funding agencies or from big pharma often goes to diseases which are not necessarily the biggest problems in the developing world. So this is where an agency like WHO would come in to set priorities and to drive a research agenda. And we did that for COVID, but we also do that for many other things. So even when you think about research, there's normative work to be done in research. How do you set a research agenda? How do you prioritize? There are standard methods for these things. And then, of course, there's a lot of capacity building. We saw, for example, that when you analyze the amount of research funding that went during COVID, billions and billions of dollars, if you add up, I'm not talking about vaccine development here, but just research that was being done in countries, 90% of it was in high and upper middle income countries. So clearly we need, and this has been known for a long time, that if you look at the whole African continent, there's very little happening in terms of research. So those things need to change. So again, WHO is a voice to bring those things up. So research was another part of the science division, and looking also at upstream, at foresight. And then the third area was digital health, which clearly we didn't know at that time that everybody would move to digital during the pandemic, but digital health was identified as going to be something for the future that really we need to be working again on standards, preferably open source standards on interoperability, on security issues, but also helping countries to set up their own national digital health infrastructure, just like India did. But many countries don't have the capacity to do that on their own. Now, the external facing part of my role was really the engagement with the scientific community more broadly outside, because again, it's WHO basically engages with health ministries, health departments, medical doctors, public health people, and other health personnel, nurses, and so on. But here we were saying we need to engage with a wider scientific community that we have a lot of learnings from, and also to help us anticipate and think about what advances in science and technology are likely to impact public health or impact clinical medicine. So, for example, CRISPR technology and gene editing is going to play a bigger role in medicine. And so we need to anticipate that, and we need to start thinking not only about how we could help to advance, the potential of that technology, but also looking at ethical, social, and legal issues that may come up, particularly again with thinking about countries which may not have the capacity to do this on their own. We, in that case, provide a framework. So, in fact, right around the time when the Chinese scientist, Dr. He, did that experiment where he, on embryos, had used gene editing to interfere with the CCR5 gene, and then twin babies were actually born. This is a type of heritable gene editing. So there are two kinds, obviously somatic, and if you do it on the germline, then that change will pass on to future generations. So the global scientific community was clear that that kind of gene editing cannot proceed outside of the laboratory because we don't understand enough about what will happen, a few generations down the line. So when that happened, we were actually in the process of setting up a committee to look at an ethical and governance framework. But somebody already did the experiment. So maybe WHO should have done that 2 or 3 years ago before, to tell countries that this is how you might want to regulate this new technology. Similarly, the use of artificial intelligence in medical applications, diagnostics or treatment. In fact, AI now today has applications across the board. How do you deal with the ethical and other issues that come up when you're talking about either making a diagnosis or recommending a treatment for a patient? So I think now ICMR also has this guideline, but WHO developed that about a year ago. So those are some of the other functions which are more outward facing, and including, of course, the foresight, looking ahead, looking at trends in science and technology, and being prepared and anticipating. So while we were doing all of that, and just a few months into that role, of course, we heard about the new virus that was circulating in Wuhan, and that was around New Year. And then early in the year 2020, of course, we also got the confirmation that it was identified as a novel coronavirus. And there was no identified role for a chief scientist during a pandemic. Obviously, nobody had thought of that. And therefore, what happened was actually just a natural sequence of events where we have the emergencies program who deals with the response to the outbreaks and to the pathogen. But there was clearly, with a novel pathogen, there's a huge amount of, well, everything is a knowledge gap, essentially. You don't know anything about this virus. You can make some guesses, and that's what initially one does, is what do we know about other coronaviruses, or what do we know about other respiratory viruses? And based on that, we can do some precautionary measures can be put in place. So those are the initial guidelines as till you start learning more. So what was different, I think, this time was because of the use of genomic sequencing to detect this novel pathogen. Within 48 hours, we also had a PCR test protocol that had been developed that was put on the internet, so countries could start setting up their diagnostic laboratories. And of course, what happened also was that people who, had the capacity to develop vaccines took the genetic sequence and started working on vaccine development, particularly the new mRNA platforms. So this is what, advances in science and technology do, is in no previous pandemic was it possible that within a few days of knowing about something happening unusual somewhere, that you could start vaccine development, that people around the world could start testing. And also that data that was coming out of China was also informing us about the clinical manifestations, who was being impacted. So very early on, we knew older people were more severely affected than younger people. The children seem to be the least impacted in terms of clinical and also the different manifestations of this disease. So in February of 2020, we had a very big global research and innovation forum that actually brought together almost 400 people. So yes, we still had a physical meeting at that time. There were some people connected online. That was one of the very early days of this concept of a Zoom meeting. So I remember struggling with, the IT and everything. And we had only about, I think, 10 people online, and the rest were all physically present. But even that was hard to manage. So 3 days of laying out the research priorities, the gaps in knowledge, and forming expert groups that would continue to work on that. And Sandhya was mentioning that she attended many of those events. Of course, they were all online later on, but we had literally thousands of people participating, and we would discuss each theme, like what have we learned about epidemiology? What have we learned about transmissibility? What have we learned about clinical manifestations? And then, of course, about what's the updates on the development of diagnostics, vaccines, therapeutics, immunology, virology, But very importantly, also, we had right from the beginning a group that looked at social and public health measures, and that was new, and also at ethics. And I think that was an excellent move because we had a very good group of bioethicists from around the world really thinking about ethical issues as they were coming up. So when contact tracing became the norm and all of these apps were being developed and used in countries, there was concern that perhaps some governments could use that information in ways which were not only for COVID tracking, or it could be for monitoring of people's movements, etc. So there could be issues related to human rights. So that's an ethical, you could say, a quandary where you will need to use it for a public health purpose, but there could also be misuse of the same. So the bioethicists then laid out what would be the right approach, what's the framework, what should countries be careful about, what should people know about this, and so on. Similarly, there were other things like human challenge studies. So human challenge studies are when you actually deliver the pathogen, virus or bacteria to somebody, you challenge them with that when you're actually wanting to test either a vaccine or a drug. So this has been done for diseases like typhoid and malaria and so on. But the question here is that at that time, we did not have a drug or a vaccine for this disease. And so if you challenge somebody and they got really ill, then that becomes a very ethically problematic issue. So again, this group developed a framework without saying you should do or you should not do, a framework for how a national ethics body or a national regulatory body might look at the question of human challenge studies. And in all of these instances, it always boils down to benefit versus risk. And if you minimize the risks as much as possible and the benefits are very tangible, then you could probably justify going ahead with research like that. Mandatory vaccination was another issue. So these are just examples. Some countries went for mandatory vaccination for certain groups of individuals. So again, what's the ethics behind that? Because there were people already saying, you can't force us to take vaccines. Now, the scientific part, I must say, was an exhilarating experience to just witness how people from around the world, scientists working in different disciplines, practically gave up what they were doing and shifted their attention to COVID. And that is how I think we got physicists and others interested in this and they started studying transmission. But similarly, immunologists gave up whatever they had been doing and shifted to COVID. Epidemiologists, modelers, of course, clinical researchers, all started doing, clinical studies, clinical trials. So, and there was this, the whole atmosphere was like one of sharing data very openly. So there was no holding back. There was no concept that I'm going to publish my paper until then, I'm going to keep this data. Of course, all the medical journals also had announced very early on that they would be comfortable with data being put out on preprints and then being considered by, so even all the journals did that, including all the top journals. And then we started seeing a lot of material on preprint. So I still remember the early days when we were manually going through the papers every day. We would get, the librarian would take out and we would look at, 2, 4, 8 papers. And then it started just increasing and soon it became unmanageable. You can't sit and read 100 papers. We had to find other ways of collating that. Of course, a lot of poor quality stuff also was coming out at the same time. So the thing with preprints is anything can go online. And so you also have to distinguish, between papers of good and bad quality when you're trying to use it for decision making. But on a daily basis, this was needed for putting out public health advice and recommendations. So it was a very stressful period because you had to put out guidance for the world based on limited amount of information and data. Of course, you always err on the side of caution. And especially if there is an intervention that is low cost, that is safe, then you should recommend to do it rather than not do it. because it could save lives. It could also buy time. And this is what many countries in East Asia did actually, because they had experienced SARS. And so the moment they knew that there was another coronavirus outbreak, they went into masking. They put in place all the SOPs that they had already thought about when they went through SARS, the isolation, the track and trace, the contact tracing, all of that was much more efficiently done. And so if you look at some of the countries like South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, even Japan, of course, Australia and New Zealand were very strict in terms of being islands. They imposed very strict travel restrictions. So nobody was coming or going from the countries. But these are the countries where the public also followed, because normally also if you go to these countries, you'll see a lot of people wearing masks when they go in public transport. So it is a culturally accepted thing, whereas in Europe, it was very different. There was no culture of wearing masks and so on. So it was something very new for people. But anyway, the point was that this global community of scientists were working day and night. We had daily, weekly meetings. And as the variants, the concept of variants, came along, we expected this virus would mutate. So at some point in the summer, there was the group that was set up to actually monitor the variants. And then there was a big discussion on the naming, because in the beginning, the variants were being named by the country in which it was first identified. And so if you remember Alpha, it was sometimes referred to as a UK variant. Beta was a South African, and so on. So this was obviously not the best approach, and doesn't go with our naming conventions either. So we're not supposed to stigmatize people or places when you name a pathogen. So we had to then go to the Greek, and this was again with discussions, lot of proposals, etc. And then the alpha beta type of a naming system came into play. But even till today, that group is there. It exists. It meets. They look whenever there is a unusual cluster reported from somewhere, or a sequence is reported from somewhere, like what we have in India today is the XBB 1.16 variant that seems to be quite infectious. So of course, every time the virus is always trying its best to survive, and sooner or later you get a combination of mutations that enable it to overcome the antibody response that we have in our body. So this particular variant is able to overcome the antibodies that we have because of vaccination or even natural infection. And that is why you then see a surge in cases. The difference, of course, now between now and what happened in the beginning was that you have largely vaccinated population in most countries. And so the impact of these new variants hopefully is much less in terms of resulting in severe disease. But there were many such groups that were set up. We were anticipating the development of vaccines and drugs, or at least hoping. In March of 2020, one did not know whether you would have an effective vaccine, because there are many pathogens for which we have never been able to develop. And influenza is a good example. Influenza is a virus for which we do not have a very effective vaccine. But we were lucky. But the point was that the WHO's normative role played an important role here, because we were able to develop the benchmarks. What should a good vaccine for COVID look like? Because if developers don't have a benchmark, they won't be able to do the right type of clinical trials. And so we said a target product profile for a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine would be that it should be at least 50% effective. We didn't set the bar very high at that time. We didn't know. But going by influenza, 50% efficacy is, fairly reasonable. So we would have been comfortable with the vaccine with 50% efficacy, but we also give the 95% confidence intervals around that. And of course, also safety is very, very important, because a vaccine is given to healthy people. So it has to be extremely safe. At the same time, we needed to do the clinical development very fast. You can't wait. I think prior to the pandemic, the earliest a vaccine has been licensed is 4 years, and that was a mumps vaccine. But most vaccines take a minimum of five to sometimes 10 years for the entire development to take place. And sometimes it takes equal amount of time for it to find its way into low income countries. But in this case, it happened in under 12 months. And the reasons are that from the beginning, there's clarity on what was needed because of I guess, the investments in R&D that had taken place over the last couple of decades. There were many platforms, vaccine platforms that people had been working on, like the mRNA platform had been was being investigated by a few groups for different diseases. And in fact, some of them had gone into phase 1 trials. Similarly, the adenovirus, which the Oxford group was developing for MERS, they repurposed it. So people repurposed vaccines that they may have been working for other diseases and took this genetic sequence and reformulated it. And so they were able to create vaccine candidates quite rapidly. And then, of course, it had to go very quickly into clinical trials. So this is where I think government support, government funding, and regulatory agencies came in, because governments put a lot of funding into the development of vaccines. They also facilitated and enabled clinical trials, use existing networks to trial these, and the regulatory harmonization that happened also enabled, because again, the usual way of licensure is for the company to go to one regulator, submit a dossier, get approval, go to another regulator, submit a dossier, get approval. And WHO, of course, plays the role of pre-qualifying vaccines and drugs. So many countries who don't have strong regulatory system rely on WHO pre-qualification. But in this case, there were at least 28 of the largest regulatory agencies around the world that had come together. They already have a group, and WHO is part of that. And in addition, many countries said if once WHO pre-qualified, it's, we will accept. That really cut short the time between the availability of the product globally and access at the country level. Literally within 24 to 48 hours, you would get country approval, which never happens. And that no product can be used in a country without the regulator licensing it. So I think that's also something that's, for me, was a very positive thing for the future of how products can be regulated, and either regional or global harmonization of regulatory standards would enable new products to actually reach people much, much faster, because even today there are delays, long delays before people have access to new products because of the regulatory rules. So again, I think that's the African Medicines Agency was set up just recently because Africa said we need to have a regulator for the continent, just like Europe has the European Medicines Agency. In addition, of course, every country has their own regulator, but at least at the within that grouping of countries, you can have one body that does a lot of the work, because it is a lot of work if you really want to regulate your drugs and vaccines properly, even whether you're manufacturing it, of course, but also if you're importing it. So the normative side of, I think that WHO played in terms of coordination, facilitation, but also setting the standards, setting the benchmarks, having the regulatory team. Literally, they were working day and night, looking at dossiers, and as data from vaccine trials was coming in, everybody was, of course, looking to see how quickly WHO would issue the emergency use listing, because the global procurement bodies like UNICEF and Gavi also cannot procure vaccines unless they are approved by WHO. That's just the way that it operates. Then we had to think about rolling out vaccines where that you can do your best assessments of safety, of benefit and risks at the time that you roll out, especially for an emergency. But there is always a small chance that later on you'll find that there are some very rare side effects that show up only when it's given, to millions of people rather than tens of thousands of people. Because a trial size, the average trial size for these vaccine trials were anywhere between 30 to 50,000 people. Whereas you're ultimately using it in billions of people. Today, 14 billion doses have been administered around the world. So to do that, we had to set up also a compensation mechanism. And for the first time, I think there was a global compensation mechanism that was set up by the partners, that is WHO, Gavi, CEPI, and UNICEF, that came together to form COVAX. Now, while the science was progressing, there was also this realization in WHO that the access to these products is going to be a problem. In fact, very early in the pandemic, if you remember, we saw shortages of things like masks, of personal protective equipment, of oxygen. And countries that were manufacturing it were not sending it outside their borders. And so many countries, suddenly faced shortages. And we've all heard the stories of how people were, healthcare workers were having to do with whatever they had, to protect themselves. And of course, one of the sad things of this pandemic is that, the brunt was in the early days was borne by healthcare workers, and, very large numbers of them died as well. And also today now suffer from long COVID, etc. But we recognize that historically, we've always had an issue of inequities in access. And so in order to address that, this body called the ACT Accelerator was set up. So that was access to COVID tools. That's diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. And it was a coming together of all the global health agencies that had anything to do with the development of these. So you had on the vaccine side, Gavi, CEPI, then you had the Global Fund, for drugs and other products. They got into oxygen and, many other things. United, and then the big funders, the Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust. And then you also had the pharmaceutical manufacturers, both the generics as well as the big pharma. And of course, WHO was the convening body. The idea was that, in a pandemic, you can't set up a new institution or organization to deal with it. But each of these existing bodies has a role to play, either in R&D or in procurement or in supporting research or trials. And so if you come together, can you actually work together to speed up, what needs to happen? And so I think on the vaccine side, there was COVAX that I was involved with, which probably worked better because we had partners with very clear-cut roles and responsibilities. You had CEPI, that was the upstream, the funder of R&D. They were already funding several candidate vaccines. There was Gavi for procurement and delivery, and WHO for, all of the policy, regulatory standards, etc., and convening of countries, and in UNICEF also working in countries to help support delivery. So with that kind of organization, we were able to move, though of course we faced challenges in delivery. We did not have the doses that had been promised to COVAX for a variety of reasons, because every country was prioritizing their own population first. And therefore, those areas of the world, those countries that had manufacturing capacity were in a much better situation compared to those who did not. And again, the African continent, but then many other countries also, Latin America and in Asia, were dependent very much on either imports or donations. And so the COVAX, even though it had actually booked, hundreds of millions of doses of vaccine, was sent to the back of the queue. And therefore, many countries that depended on COVAX had to wait a long time, almost to the end of 2021, by which time, the high-income countries had already vaccinated over 40-50% of their population, whereas most African countries were still below 5%. Even their frontline workers and health workers and elderly had not been vaccinated. The WHO had proposed an equitable allocation mechanism and framework anticipating this problem and saying that we will have limited supplies of vaccines in the beginning. Nobody can scale to billions overnight. So in the beginning, you'll have dozens of millions, then we'll have hundreds of millions, and then slowly the scale up will happen. So during that early time, how do we best use the limited supplies? And the best use obviously is to give it to people who are at the highest risk. So by that time we knew the highest risk group. So there was a very nice framework developed which said that the elderly, the people above 60, the frontline workers, obviously healthcare workers and other frontline essential workers, if you protect them, and they constitute not more than 10 to 15% of the population in any country, maybe slightly more in high income countries, you have more older people as a proportion. But overall, if you see 10 to 15%, you can cover them. And then as more vaccine is manufactured, you can give it to the rest of the population. That was theoretically the way to deal with this issue of limited supplies and being equitable to everybody around the world. But that was not how it turned out eventually. And so that framework, while very good on paper, did not work out. And that is why today there is a move to actually develop a pandemic treaty or a pandemic accord, which member states are negotiating. And there's a commitment that by 2024, there will be a globally legally binding agreement which will lay out for countries what they need to do in terms of to not just during a pandemic, but in the intervening period. Obviously, surveillance and data sharing is very important because you don't know when and where the next pathogen is going to emerge. But what we do know is that zoonotic infections are on the rise, and therefore there will be more pathogens probably jumping the animal to human across species. And so we have to be prepared, and that could happen at any time. And as you know, today, every other day almost, you hear about some new pathogen. Now, that's partly because surveillance has improved over the last couple of years. Genomic surveillance has improved a lot. And countries are now able to detect and identify the outbreaks that are happening, which in the past would have gone unnoticed. If in some remote corner of some country, a few people are infected, or they may even die of something, you never really get to know what it was. But today, we know that, okay, today, H3N2 was a viral influenza strain circulating. There's outbreak of Marburg happening in a few countries, Lassa fever, Ebola, etc. So surveillance has improved. Data sharing is very important. And that's one of the things that will be laid out. It is already there in the international health regulations that one has to share data. Earlier, the IHR used to only have a few lists of diseases where you had to share data, but today it's across all pathogens. So it has to be timely, it has to be informed, but also the reaction of countries needs to be reasonable. So what happened also when we saw is that when a certain country said something about a new variant, like South Africa announced the Omicron variant, very rapidly actually they found and identified it as a new variant. A travel ban was placed on them by many countries. Travel and trade was halted. So there's a tremendous economic cost. And therefore, if you want countries to be incentivized to share data, then there needs to be also a reasonable, there should not be this type of negative repercussions. So the international health regulations need to be, are being looked at again. There have been a lot of recommendations. In fact, over 300 recommendations have been made in the last 2 years on how to better prepare and respond to pandemics. So these 300 recommendations can be broadly divided into governance, systems and tools, and financing. And without going into a lot of details now, I mean, they're all complex, but the financing aspect has been addressed by creating a pandemic fund that's sitting in the World Bank. It still doesn't have a lot of money in it, but it has been created. The governance is being discussed by the member states of the WHO, and hopefully there'll be a pandemic treaty. And part of that, of course, it addresses the issue of equity, that I just mentioned. And in fact, that's at the very heart of the pandemic treaty. So it has to address that and lay out, because you also saw during the pandemic, the difficulties we had with the sharing of, so there was no problem with sharing of knowledge and data in terms of the research and science that was going on. But when it came to the product, when it came to a vaccine, there were challenges in those companies sharing their know-how. And this did not happen. Quite early on, India and South Africa went to the World Trade Organization, WTO, with a request that all IP should be waived for products related to COVID-19. Now, this, after 2 years, there was an agreement which was very diluted, which applied only to vaccines and only for a very limited period. By that time, anyway, it was too late because there were enough vaccines that had been made. But looking ahead, ideally, what one would like to see is the research happening. Of course, a lot of it is publicly funded research. Most of the funding is from public sources, so it's all taxpayer money, and yet there was no compulsion that those products need to be shared with the public in an equitable way, though they were being sold at whatever price, the companies wanted to sell it at. And that, in principle, is wrong. But those are the rules in countries that exist today. So this is why I think that for public health problems where it's really a question of life and death, it's not a question of, something that's nice to have. We need rules that if there is public funding of research, then there must be clauses in the contracts which enable access and which enable the government to purchase at a certain price, or agent organizations like WHO, whatever is a procurement mechanism, to purchase it at a cost and in real time. So there's no point getting the vaccines after 1 year of the pandemic when you've lost so many lives. So you must get it in real time so that people everywhere can have access to it. But this also applies to national, I think, priorities, that when there is a lot of funding that goes into the product from government, then definitely the government should have a say. So there's been a lot of debate and thinking about this, but one of the challenges that we saw, that I observed, was the lack of manufacturing capacity as well. R&D capacity, yes, but also manufacturing capacity. So if you take the whole of the African continent, less than 1% of vaccine that's used in Africa is actually made in Africa. I think some yellow fever vaccine is made, but otherwise it's all imported. And so, there's obviously there's a huge dependence. And so the solution, we thought, was to actually have a program where you can enable scientists working in countries and companies to start manufacturing. And if you, of course, we knew that would not happen to be of benefit during the pandemic. But for the future, we thought that's the only way forward. And this is why we set up the mRNA technology transfer program, when we observed that the companies which had this technology were not willing to share it with us, despite we had requested many times. And so the only way was to go for a sort of an open science approach, where you take what's available in the public domain and make the vaccine from scratch. And it was possible to do. So a group of scientists in South Africa actually recreated the Moderna vaccine just from publicly available information. And today there's a network of 16 centers around the world, mostly in low and middle income countries, where this mRNA technology can now, people get trained and can use it to develop other products. Not that they all have to work on COVID now, but you could use mRNA for dengue, you could use it for HPV, you could use it for TB, you could use it, for whatever is a public health priority in that country or region, but also for monoclonal antibody production, for non-communicable diseases, for cancer. So the technology enables you to use it for many different things. So the idea was that technology should be in the hands of people everywhere and should not be an exclusive thing belonging to few people. So I think that's what we enabled through this program. It's still in very early stages, but hopefully it's really going to make a difference in the long term. But I think there also needs to be debate in the public domain about what is ethical in terms of this type of R&D. I think we have also lessons for countries where we know today that a mission approach where you come together, you have a goal, each one knows their roles and responsibilities. There's funding put on the table from public sector and private sector. And the public institutions and the government actually enable the research and R&D to happen in a way where, you facilitate, but at the same time, of course, ensure that there is quality is maintained, that, there's data integrity, that, you don't shortcut. So this question used to come many times to us that, have you shortcutted many of the normal procedures in order to deliver the vaccine so quickly? Yes, but not compromising the safety and efficacy in any way. So that one has to be very clear about, because otherwise the public will not have any faith and trust. And the other thing we learned was that the relationship of the trust that people have in each other and that people have in governments actually played a very big role. And studies that have been done have shown that countries where people actually believed the government and were comfortable with the messaging and were complying actually had lower rates of infection and much better vaccine coverage and uptake than countries where there was polarization, where there was suspicion, where there was, where things actually became political. And we've seen many examples of countries where there was no problem of access to vaccines. They had supply and yet people wouldn't take the vaccine because of these other issues. So very early on in February of 2020, the Director General actually had said in one of his statements that the infodemic is as dangerous as a viral epidemic. So an infodemic is, as the name suggests, an overdose of information that comes to you side by side with, real epidemic that may be going on. And a lot of it, information is either misinformation or disinformation. And this serves to confuse people. And it actually has a very negative influence on, people's compliance with public health measures. So when we're getting a lot of confusing messages, and particularly through WhatsApp, I met one expert from a West African country who told me that people in her country mainly relied on WhatsApp to get their news. They didn't think that there was any other reliable source of news. And therefore, if you're getting it through WhatsApp, then of course, anything that happens around the world can influence you. And so misinformation also spreads very rapidly, to create panic and so on. So we realized that we also had to deal with that, which was not really something I expected or anticipated. I did not expect that there would be so much of an anti-vaccine. Even before we had a vaccine for COVID, there were anti-vaccine groups that were very active, that were telling people that this was all very dangerous. People pretending to be doctors or even some real doctors were in groups saying things like this. And then we also saw with treatments that this was happening, with hydroxychloroquine being a good example, where it really polarized people for some reason when it should have been very straightforward. The clinical trial either works or doesn't work. It shows whether the drug works or doesn't work. We saw that the problem with clinical trials also was that there were a lot of clinical trials started very early on with lots of different drugs, but they were all too small to answer any question. And so that is why the WHO, we set up the Solidarity trial. This was, I think, again, a very good, for me, a model of how even during the middle of an emergency, we got 50 countries to participate in a Solidarity trial, which was basically looking at repurposed drugs that was completely digital and online. It had absolutely no paperwork. Randomization was done centrally. Data collection was it took just 4 to 5 minutes for the doctor to fill up the questionnaire, because in an emergency, you can't expect busy ICU doctors to spend hours filling up forms. And so it was kept very simple, but it was a trial that was done with the public health outcome in mind, which was, does this drug reduce mortality in hospitalized COVID patients? And so we looked at hydroxychloroquine, at lopinavir, ritonavir, at interferon, at remdesivir, and now there are still some drugs which are in the trial, though of course now patient enrollment has come down. But so those results and the results from 1 or 2 other trials that were done in very large numbers were the ones which gave us solid data, like the efficacy of dexamethasone to reduce mortality, or the lack of efficacy of all of these other drugs that were being promoted by people, or the very marginal benefit of remdesivir. So, but despite, these data coming out, guidelines in countries didn't change, or they took very long to change, or there was again polarization. So we need to think about how we do this. How do we not only do better research, but use the data to inform our public policies, our guidelines, and our practice. And of course, in a country like India, where you have large private sector, we need the compliance not only from government, people working in government institutions, but also in the private sector. And again, this shouldn't be just for emergencies or pandemics. This should be for all diseases. I've worked in tuberculosis, and I know that TB is a disease, for example. You can go and ask 100 people how they treat TB, and you'll get 80 different answers, despite the fact that, there are standard guidelines for the treatment of TB. So I'm just trying to see if there were many other things about, okay, maybe a couple of last points I would say, and then we could stop and have questions and discussion, is around the fact that non-communicable diseases today, and of course we have climate change and conflict also as very big global drivers of the economy, but was observed in many countries that the people who had higher mortality were those who belonged to racial and ethnic minorities, or belonged to the socioeconomically weaker sections. And this actually brought out the fact that the existing inequalities in society were exacerbated by the pandemic. So the pandemic did not create inequalities, but existing inequalities between and within countries were exacerbated. And also, for me, a big learning was that there are drivers of disease which are outside of the health system. So, for example, underlying non-communicable disease, diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular, these were the major risk factors for poor outcomes. And so, where you had large populations with these underlying comorbidities, you also saw correspondingly high mortality. So to address these, just like we address a pandemic, you need a whole of government approach, whole of society approach, and you need global solidarity, I think, to address things like climate change, to address, commercial determinants of health. Today, I think the commercial determinants of health are really, really important. They can be positive or negative. They can be direct or indirect, but we're all impacted by those determinants. In the past, we talked about social, economic, environmental determinants of health, but today the commercial determinants of health, whether it is the way that food is packaged and sold, or the advertising or the lobbying that is done to influence policy, all of these things actually play a much bigger role than we realize, and there are no very easy ways to address. So we need more research for sure, but what is clear is that you need the upstream action as well. It's not enough to just build the health centers and the hospitals, but we need to address the drivers of disease, which are poor diets, air pollution, water, sanitation, mental health, cities quality of life, those things. Mental health has taken a very big toll, and some surveys have shown that rates of anxiety and depression in young people in particular have gone up tremendously. And I think this is probably related to the whole uncertainty that exists, and perhaps about the state of the world itself. But we haven't done enough. It's easier to deal with physical ailments, and even there, long COVID and things like that are not so easy to deal with because we don't understand the pathogenesis fully. But addressing this mental health issues at large scale is something that we have not fully grappled with as yet. So I hope that I've given you a flavor of what it was like to actually be in the midst of a pandemic in a place where, which was a center of action, maybe you could say, was really the fulcrum, and lots of countries relying on advice. So I think, the role of WHO clearly in global health is extremely important. And I hope that those negotiations for the pandemic treaty go well, but also we need to think about these issues that were raised during the pandemic to deal with some of the other public health crises that are facing us. So lots of learnings, I think a lot of positives that we can take away and hopefully apply in the future. But clearly, I think solidarity, collaboration, we used to say, there was a phrase we used a lot, and that was science, solutions, and solidarity. So science can provide solutions and has provided solutions and will continue to, but without the right approach, without ethics, as Sandhya was saying, without consideration for equity, without solidarity, it's not going to help humankind as much as it should or it could. So I will stop there. Sandhya, maybe you want to open it up. Happy to take questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. I just wanted to, ask a little bit about, the future prospects for a repetition of this kind of a pandemic that can happen again. And in that context, I think it's very useful to know whether this particular one had a possible laboratory origin. There's a lot of theories going about, and I just wanted to know your take on both the questions, about the future and the past origin. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. There's obviously a huge amount of interest in where did it come from, what was it, and where. And that question, unfortunately, is not yet fully answered. There are bits of, even recently there was discussion in the scientific circles about some new data. It was not new data, it was actually old data, but sort of analyzed and brought out about the mixture of animal DNA along with the COVID genomes, and particularly pointing towards raccoon dogs as a possible intermediate host. We know for SARS-1, it took a long time actually to find out that civet cats were the intermediate host. Of course, the coronavirus came from bats. And similarly for MERS, it was found out that camels, dromedary camels, were the intermediate host. Now, so it's a possibility, raccoon dogs, but other animals have also been suggested in the past. That particular wet market has a host of live animals that were being sold there. And so there was a lot of potential for exchange of viruses between these animals. There's a group that WHO set up actually to look, it's called SAGO. It's a study of the origins of viruses. And it was not only for this pandemic, but also to have a framework for how you would investigate, because clearly it's an important question to know how and where this virus actually jumped. There's, of course, also the other hypothesis that it could have been an accidental leak from a lab, and so biosafety is also very important today when we talk about dealing with pathogens and labs. So that question is still, I think, open. There are hypotheses, they need to be addressed. Your other question is something I alluded to, the fact that another pandemic is almost certainly going to come. Nobody can predict when and where. Nobody. And so it would be foolish to try to speculate on that. All we can do is to be prepared with some of the things that we talked about, surveillance and so on. But one of the important things, I think, is creating capacity at the local level. You see, all epidemics will start and end in communities. They don't just appear from somewhere. And so if you have good surveillance, if you have teams at the district level, which can pick up something unusual happening, investigate it, and take action, if you have informed health authorities that know how to do that decision making and act on it, you need a risk communication plan, you need, many things to be put in place. You need a trained workforce. And this is why I believe that a public health cadre is going to be important in every state in India. This has been envisioned in the National Health Policy 2017, but it's not a reality. I think having clinical staff and public health cadre is very different. And if we had that, then what you would have this type of multidisciplinary team that knows what to do. And training epidemiologists is also going to be important, which is something that's happening. So short answer is next pandemic is when, not if. And so you have to prepare today. You could have multiple epidemics and pandemics also going on. There's nothing to prevent tomorrow a new strain of influenza, for example, from suddenly becoming pathogenic.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, ma'am, for such an insightful talk. So, amidst the pandemic, we have been through unprecedented times, and throughout the pandemic, other programs, for example, the ones based on nutrition, have been impacted negatively. So, could it have been possible that during the vaccination drives, we could have had a combined strategy? For example, we could have also detected children and women for anemia. We could have run through the hemoglobin tests, and then we could have had a multiple strategy. We vaccinated people, and then along with that also had a anemia prevalence, just for example.
Yes, you make a very valid point, and I didn't go into that side of what we observed in terms of the disruptions in healthcare delivery which happened around the world. Again, the disruptions were more in lower income countries, and many routine programs, immunization, maternal and child health, screening for cancers, even supply of essential medicines, and in some cases even maternal health deliveries were impacted, as you rightly pointed out. So this all points to the resilience of health systems. When faced with a shock, everything else suffered and people attended to COVID. TB is a good example where, the detection of TB and the treatment of TB really went down. And in the subsequent year, we saw that deaths actually went up due to TB. Now, whether other things could have been addressed along with the vaccination program, I think at that time, the priority was to vaccinate as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, because we had already suffered the impact, of the Delta wave, and every day mattered. We didn't know when the next variant was going to come. And therefore, I think when you have such a massive undertaking, where you need to vaccinate, almost 1 billion people with 2 doses, then it's very hard to build other things into that program. But I think looking ahead at how we run our public health programs, I think you're very right that we should think about how to combine, different priorities or objectives that we have and be as efficient as possible. But in an emergency, I think it would have been very difficult to do that. Yeah.
We'll take a couple of questions from our online audience and then we'll come back.
Yeah, I'll take this. Yeah, so participants from Zoom, now you can unmute and ask question. Professor Datta?
Yeah, actually the question that I wanted to ask was already asked before, but I would like to take that a little forward. The WHO team that went to Wuhan, maybe in the early part of 2020, basically gave a certificate that, this is probably from animal sources and not from the lab. Was that too quick a response? Number one. Number two, Pfizer, I heard, has recently jacked up their vaccine prices by some few times, 3-4 times or something. Now, is that something that, I mean, how can that be countered? Or is it just that there's competition and other companies will sell it cheaper and so on and hope that things get delivered?
Yeah, thanks. I think your first question was about the WHO team that went to Wuhan initially, and it was a joint investigation with the Chinese scientists and the WHO team. And when they came back, they had a very extensive report on which many hypotheses were tabled. And they said that the most likely, they felt the most likely was an animal to human jump. The Director General had clarified at that point that none of the hypotheses were off the table. So the WHO had made it clear that even the accidental lab leak theory was definitely needed to be ruled out by looking at more data from the labs. And that unfortunately has, not been very successful so far. Like access to all of the data has not been there. And so that's why it's still not ruled out as a possibility. Your other question wasn't very clear, but I think you were asking about Pfizer raising its prices.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, is there no way that one can sort of help people who need that vaccine? I mean, how can somebody afford something which suddenly gets increased in price? So is it just that there is competition in the market and that should take care of it?
So one way to help people, of course, is to have a pool and do pool procurement and negotiate a price. So, for example, the price that COVAX had negotiated is much lower than what these companies were charging in the market. So similarly, when governments negotiate a price with the companies, they do have some leverage to do that. But the market price, companies set. I don't think that there's a way of apart from naming and shaming, which of course I think WHO has been doing, and there's very little authority that WHO has on anyone.
So we'll take that couple of burning questions because I think, and there's tea, and please come and join the discussions.
Yeah, thank you. Great canvas. My question is, does WHO concern itself with environmental governance? I mean, issues like land management, ecology, anything that mitigates the species jump from animals to humans? Yeah. Is there any involvement in that?
Yeah, that's very interesting because clearly, the WHO does have an interest and has had for a long time on the environment because environmental determinants of health. But the focus has been maybe to a large extent on water, sanitation, and then I think air pollution. But even before the pandemic, but certainly after the pandemic, it became clear that these issues were extremely important and that human health was very closely connected with the health of the environment and other species. And so a One Health approach is, as you've heard, is talked about a lot now. So WHO came together with the World Organization for Animal Health, OIE, as well as with FAO for agriculture and with the United Nations Environment Program. And so these 4 agencies today are now jointly working together to address some of the factors which may, promote this. And of course, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, the human animal, all of that is related, as you mentioned, And they're all governed by different laws, and we've seen the COP, subsequent COPs are taking health more seriously. So I think COP26 perhaps was the first where there was a separate session on health. There was a health pavilion. COP27, more attention to health. COP28. So the pandemic has brought that attention even within the environmental sector. But those negotiations, obviously, then there are separate. And in fact, some people are arguing that these should come together, that you shouldn't have separate negotiations on health and separately on environment, because the links are very good. But right now, that's how it happens globally.
Young person.
Ma'am, you said that WHO didn't have authority on much. It's on. Can you hear me? But as far as I know, people in India and even in China, doctors were making an outcry, declare it a pandemic, but it took a long time for WHO to do so. So what is your take on that? I just wanted to understand.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So according to this international health regulations, which is what is the approved set of global regulations that the member states themselves created in 2005. So after SARS, these regulations were updated. So according to those regulations, the WHO has the authority to declare a public health emergency of international concern. So there is no such thing as a declaration of a pandemic anywhere in the rules. So the highest level of alert is a public health emergency of international concern. And there is a committee that meets and discusses the situation. So previously, for example, it's been declared for Ebola a couple of times, for polio, for Zika, for H1N1, and so on. So when these first cases were happening in China, this committee met on January 21st and 22nd. At that time, there were very few cases outside China, couple of maybe 20, 30 cases. So, and the full impact in terms of mortality and all was not felt to be, it hadn't spread much. So on that basis, they recommended not to call it a public health emergency. But the DG then called the same group within a week to review the data again. And by that time, I think there was something like 82 cases outside China and no deaths yet reported. So on the 30th of January, 2020 is when WHO declared the public health emergency of international concern based on the advice of the committee. The pandemic declaration came much later in March, as you know, but that doesn't have a legal framework around it. The word pandemic, of course, makes people sit up and take notice. But actually what people should have taken notice of is that declaration on January 30th, which is the highest level of alert. And at that time, if all countries had acted and put in place measures, then probably that impact would have been much less. Some countries did take it seriously at that time and put in place measures, but sitting in Europe, I know that many countries there did not. And so they faced huge waves and then had to go into these full lockdowns and things like that.
Only because it's quite late, but please join the tea when Dr. Swaminathan will be there, and you can continue to have chai pe charcha. So thank you very much, Dr. Swaminathan. It was very nice to hear how the pandemic